This podcast is brought to you by the good people at Living with Hemophilia, the online hemophilia community brought to you by Bayer. Living with Hemophilia is the destination of choice for a plethora of useful info, like medical and non-medical tips, helpful advice, information on programs for all ages and stages, leadership opportunities and initiatives, sewing patterns, and videos, the best videos. And because it's on the internet, it's easy to find. Simply type livingwithhemophilia.com into your search bar, and there you are. Thank you, Internet. Join Bayer's community of fellow hemophilia patients, caregivers, and advocates as we put the live in Living with Hemophilia. You can even like us on Facebook. That's even better because you can use emojis on our Facebook page and receive all our latest updates. So check out Living with Hemophilia. And before you wish happy birthday to that friend from 3rd grade or share a funny meme about cats and Mondays, head over to Facebook and like Bayer's Living with Hemophilia page. You'll be glad you did.
Welcome to episode 28 of Ask the Expert. I am your host, Amy Board, and we have a unique and interesting topic to discuss today, and I'm so glad that you have joined us. Today, we're going to be discussing the growing conversation about gender bias in healthcare. Personally, I was blown away at the statistics our guest shares today, and while so many of us have experienced being marginalized or dismissed when it comes to voicing our symptoms in a doctor's office, I was shocked to hear that medicines work differently in men and women based on our genetics, and how little, if at all, research is being done to document those differences. More and more studies are showing that from the way medicines are being researched and prescribed all the way to how women are being diagnosed and related to in the doctor's office show that there is a substantial bias towards women in our healthcare system. Our guest today is Christie VanHorne. She's a consultant with CVH Consulting, and she has researched this issue. She's passionate about this issue, and she's developed a series of trainings that educate on the history of gender bias and also bring awareness to the need that we as women do have a voice, and our voice is important in shaping our own health. We're going to get into what is gender bias on a whole and how it has become a relational culture standard and how we can make change 1 inch at a time. But before we settle in, I just want to remind you to check out the Bloodstream podcast this month with Patrick and Natalie Lynch. They break down an article from Penn, the Penn newsletter, out of LA Communications, Clotting Factors. Aren't they all basically the same? Which is great because aren't they all basically the same? And they also discuss one physician's social media crusade to tear down, quote unquote, fake health news, plus so much more. It's a great and informative listen, so make sure to check that out. Also, personally, I want to hear from you this month. I always want to hear from you, but in particular this month, I want to hear from you. You're going to hear more about that as we continue our conversation. I want you to tell me your stories on how gender bias has affected you and your family. I would love to continue this topic and this conversation that we're having. So please send me your thoughts, send me your stories. The email is going to be the best way to go about it, just so we can protect patient information. But send me an email, tell me your story, and maybe we can incorporate that in some of our expert interviews going forward in the future. Our email is mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. Again, that's mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. I would love to hear from you. And last, I want to give a special thanks to Bayer Pharmaceuticals for sponsoring Ask the Expert. You know, without Bayer's support, conversations like this one, the one that I am having today, wouldn't happen. So we're so grateful. Absolutely grateful. So let's get to it. Let's get on to our episode. Today we feature Christie VanHorne. She's going to educate us on her findings on gender bias in healthcare. Christie has a long history in public health, but she also has strong ties to the bleeding disorder community. When I met her, actually, she worked for the education department at the National Hemophilia Foundation, and I know for a time she actually consulted for HFA, so she knows our community really well. Her research and her subsequent trainings that she's created for further education and awareness, in particular with this issue, just blew me out of the water. She so impressed me. I had to immediately get her on the podcast. So today we're going to dive into the meaning of gender bias and the long history of how women have been dismissed and ignored, really in terms of our health. Christie's going to walk us through how important it is for us to be mindful of how we relate to our doctors and clinical staff when we are trying to have our voices heard. But most importantly, she's going to remind us that this is a cultural, systematic issue. No one enters a room with the intention of being biased towards women. information. So it's up to all of us to gain that consciousness, to hold our clinical staff accountable, and to make efforts to relate differently in the hopes of being true partners in our health. The information Christie shares today is available for in-person trainings. That's the coolest thing about this. She can come to your chapter, she can come to your HTC, to a support group, to school functions, man, you name it. If you have an interest in bringing Christie to your town, check out her website at cvhconsultingllc.com and click that contact button. She will get a hold of you. This is a great opportunity, so make sure that you guys utilize this resource. This conversation is so important, and I'm so thrilled that you're joining us. So grab a cup of coffee and let's have ourselves a conversation. I am your host, Amy Board, and welcome to episode 28, or our gender bias and healthcare episode of the Ask the Expert podcast. I'm joined today by Christie VanHorne, the founder of CVH Consulting, a consulting firm that specializes in creating custom learning solutions and expert facilitation in the fields of nonprofit and public health. Christie, welcome to the podcast.
Amy, thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be talking to you and an honor to be on the podcast. Thank you so much.
I am so looking forward to this. We'll talk about it a little bit in the interview, but we reconnected several weeks ago, and this has just been a joy for me to just to see what you're doing. And it's just been wonderful. So I'm so excited you're going to be here.
I agree. Yes. We have known each other for quite a while. So it has been great to touch base again and reconnect in the places that we happen to be in our lives right now.
My memory of you was from a training. It was a Steps for Living training through NHF. And I was the executive director of the Colorado chapter at the time. And you did this masterful training. It was like a train the trainers of this workbook that you had put together for sessions in the community. And I thought it was wonderful. You have such a wonderful background in education and building curriculum in this way. And I just think from where I met you and where I was kind of enamored with you, not to, be too ridiculous about it. And then just to see like where you've gone, like our conversation today about some of the work that you're doing, I'm just excited. I'm excited for you.
Yes, thank you. I feel humbled by that comment, and I appreciate it. I have to say, the Steps for Living Train the Trainer and facilitating that was still, for NHF, was still one of my greatest professional and most exciting professional achievements. Just creating the workbook and the training manual, and then also getting able to facilitate it to chapters and HTC staff. So also for me, it was a huge highlight in my career, and I still hold it so near and dear to my heart. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. I appreciate it. You have, your consulting firm works in public health, and I think you have a background in public health, if that's correct. But you did, obviously we've talked about it a little bit, your connection with the bleeding disorder community, but how did you get involved with NHF? And I know you have such a heart for the bleeding disorder community since working for NHF, and just tell me a little bit about that. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't remember the year. It's been a while now that I started working for NHF. I don't have a bleeding disorder. I know that that's a common question when you're working with the bleeding disorders community, but I worked for NHF for a few years, and I think that was right around the 2012, I want to say 13, 14, somewhere in there. And then I worked on the Steps for Living, the Train the Trainer that you mentioned. And I also did a lot of work with NYLI, for those of you who are familiar with the National Youth Leadership Institute. And then I took a break. I worked in maternal and infant health for a little bit and came back to the community as a consultant, working for the Hemophilia Federation of America, or HFA, as many of us know that organization as. And I worked with them on over 3 years, really, on program development, their symposium, and also did some work with their pain management working group. And now I'm with the Michigan chapter, just again as a consultant, but that's been such a joy. They're an incredible team.
And you just like so many, you can't keep me away. I love this community. So
yeah. Yeah, I've always said once you drink the Kool-Aid, you're in.
Yeah, it's true.
These people are incredible. I've been so impressed with your work, specifically with women, with women's advocacy and the awareness of women in our community. And, you know, what we're going to talk about today, obviously, is you've created a training that introduces the concept of gender bias and the need that we have as women to find our voice when it comes to our health and our health care. And I just wanted to, see how you became so passionate about the place women hold specifically in healthcare.
Yeah, same. I am very passionate about women's health, and those who know me know that. And this question really takes me back to my time as a Peace Corps volunteer. I served in South Africa from 2004 to 2006, and that experience really opened my eyes to the health disparities that women face. And yes, men also face barriers to healthcare, no question, but women, as I'll explain, are really up against so much more, both here in the States and abroad. These disparities were central to my studies as I received my master's in public health, and in some capacity, I've worked in women's health for over 15 years. It's where my heart is, so even if I'm not working on it directly in the jobs that I hold, I have volunteered, and I consistently read and just stay as up to date as I possibly can on women's health issues. It's where my heart is.
Mm. You know, before we kind of jump in to the bulk of the conversation, I wanted to mention to our listeners that all of the information that Christie is going to share today is included in a training that she has developed for organizations, chapters, small groups, support groups that you guys can book for your own community. I didn't want to leave that point to the end in case some people had to, filter out towards the end. But this topic is so important and so timely, not only for the women in our community, but I believe our entire community. And I think our chapter leaders and our community members would have an interest in getting this training to their own chapter meeting. So Christie, how would they go about that before we get into the meat of it?
Yes, thank you. Contact me. So I'm so excited for the opportunity to work with the community and chapters. I'm actually already in discussion with a couple of them to bring one or two of the workshops to the community. I will leave them nameless for now, but I'm very eager to get this information out. There are a few ways that you can contact me. My website is simple. It's CVH Consulting LLC.com. And there's a contact button there in the right-hand corner on my website. Or my email is Christie, so CHRISTIE at CVHconsultingllc.com. And I'm also on social media. If people prefer to find me there, that's fine too. My Twitter and Instagram handle is CVH Consulting. I'm on Facebook, it's CVH Space Consulting, and then on LinkedIn is Christie VanHorne. So there are a number of ways to get in touch with me, and I look forward to hearing from them.
Yay! So Christie, my goodness, gender bias. This is going to be a big conversation today. What is gender bias, and how does it play into our current healthcare system?
Right. I mean, this is obviously the greatest place to start. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give an overview of gender bias. And then I'm going to provide a few examples to help us really understand the complexity of the problem, which is always helpful for people, right? So in healthcare, gender bias primarily refers to instances in which women are treated differently based on their gender. It is also important to note that the experience of bias and discrimination in healthcare increases as we add layers of intersecting identities. And what I mean by that is, for example, Black women or folks from the LGBTQ community, as well as those with disabilities, will face even more barrier and discrimination. And this bias that, we're discussing, it leads to a number of problems for women and other folks that I just mentioned. They are not only mistreated, they are dismissed or not trusted to know and understand their own bodies. And for this reason, they experience long delays in diagnosis, which leaves people sick and can even lead to death in certain circumstances. And as I mentioned, examples are always helpful. So let me provide a few to help us explore this problem of gender bias. The first is that women are twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with a mental health condition when presenting to a clinician with cardiovascular symptoms. They're often told it's stress or the flu, Yet in 2017, almost 300,000 women died of heart disease, and it's actually the leading cause of death for women in America. What else do we know? Just this morning, I was reading an article that stated that 1 in 6 women experience mistreatment in childbirth, and those numbers are even higher for women of color. So types of mistreatment include being shouted at or scolded, ignored, threatened to withhold treatment. I mean, imagine being in labor and experiencing any number of these things. And so many women have. We also know that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die of complications during childbirth, and that statistic is specific to here in America. And we know that being rich and famous doesn't help. We saw this example through Serena Williams, the famous tennis player's experience, and how she was treated after her C-section. She told the medical team that she needed a CT scan and blood thinners, but at first the nurses wrote her off. They told her she was confused. Only when she demanded the treatment did they actually find the blood clots that almost killed her. And one last example, because I think people and women in the bleeding disorders will really relate to this one, is it takes women an average of 10 years to be diagnosed with endometriosis. And women with endometriosis are often told, well, the pain is normal. Of course. I mean, when we have our periods, of course you're experiencing pain. And where else do we hear similar stories? Of course, right here within the bleeding disorders community. And I just want to put a little plug in because I love the podcast series that your team is doing on empowering women. You provide some incredible examples of gender bias within the community, and you're really lifting those women in their stories up. And the more we talk about it, the better things are going to be. It's really how we create change.
I'm sure you agree that gender bias just didn't come to be. It's not something that has just popped up recently. It's so ingrained in our culture and how we think and how we relate. So what is the history of this? And I'm sure it's vast and complicated, but can you kind of walk us through the history and how our current culture came to be?
Yeah, so you're right. It is extremely vast and complicated, and I'm going to try and do my best to generalize there. So understanding, the history is vital to understanding the problem. So we didn't just get here. This wasn't just, we woke up one day and gender bias was a problem. It's been a process through our history. And actually for thousands of years. The problem can be largely traced through the diagnosis of hysteria. So today, hysteria is defined as a, quote, exaggerated or uncontrollable emotion or excitement, especially among a group of people. But that certainly has not always been the case. From the time of the first description of hysteria, which was among Egyptians in 1900 BC, thousands of years ago, the condition was the quote-unquote go-to diagnosis of choice for any dysfunction of the female body. And it was really used to label women. Medicine would argue that women were inherently sick, and this would help them to justify their inferior status, right? So fast forward to the 19th century, and Freud didn't help our cause when he stated that hysteria was a mental disorder that caused physical symptoms. So we can see how this problem over time has continued to impact women and our health over thousands of years. And there's a lot of history in the middle of all of that too, and none of it was helpful to women's health. Hysteria wasn't removed from the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual until the 1950s. But experts argue that mental health disorders such as depression and anxiety quickly replaced hysteria is the catch-all diagnosis. And I'll go more into this with a few examples in a little bit, but it's still a problem, right? So they just have now gone to, well, you must be depressed or you suffer from anxiety, which really covers how they have always diagnosed us with hysteria. It's just a new way for them to give us the same diagnosis. As we see through the example of cardiovascular disease and through the experience of women with blood disorders, we know that women are still dismissed and underdiagnosed because they are written off as too emotional or hysterical. And it's this all in your head mentality is so dangerous to our health. And just to summarize, this history impacts the care we receive today, right? It helps us to understand why we are experiencing these things. It gives us context to the problem. And that really matters. It helps us to move forward and to address the disparities we experience. And I believe by understanding the history, we are more likely to recognize our doctor's reactions when we get a diagnosis that it doesn't match what we're actually experiencing or feeling. And if we're more likely to say or recognize that reaction that they have, we're more likely to possibly question them about it, which will help us to make progress. There's so much more to this, which I go into in the training. But yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot.
It seems like that the definition of hysteria, today could be summarized by, anything heightened. You mentioned, going into a doctor's room and, you have cardiovascular issues, you have pain in your chest or, and you're heightened and you're panicked, you're scared, and those feelings are dismissed. You're supposed to be level-headed and,
right.
That's interesting. That's really interesting.
It reinforces itself, right? So if you're anxious, you're going to be less likely to advocate for yourself, and it's just this terrible cycle that we're in. And yeah, it's definitely overwhelming for women and a concern, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a second.
Yeah. In continuing kind of with this overview of what this is, as we were preparing for this interview, you mentioned several times knowledge gaps that must be explained in order to grasp kind of the full picture of this, of gender bias. And so will you kind of share with our listeners what you mean by knowledge gaps?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I didn't know what they meant.
No, I didn't either, actually. The training that I created was inspired by a book called Doing Harm by Maya Dusenberry. And I also, when I read this book about a year ago, I was appalled. I was like, I have been studying and working in women's health for a very long time, and I didn't know this. I didn't know about the knowledge gap. And she breaks down the current problem of gender bias into two primary categories: the knowledge gap and the trust gap. And I'm going to discuss both briefly. To start with, the knowledge gap, to give an example, so a Dr. Austin Clayton from the National Institute of Health points out that we literally know less about every single aspect of female biology compared to men. So we do know that XX and XY chromosomes affect how we manifest disease. Women manifest symptoms differently and respond to treatment differently. Yet female patients are still treated with procedures and medications studied solely on men. So, and we have to ask ourselves, right, how can this be? It's 2019. There are a few problems. So for decades, the male body was the standard for health and disease in medicine and medical research. Even though Congress passed a law in 1993 that required clinical trials studying diseases and treatments to include women as well as men, more recent studies have shown that not nearly enough progress has been made, including women in the research and understanding how these diseases affect women. So while clinical trials funded, and this is a key point as well, while clinical trials funded by the National Institute of Health are required to include female subjects, those funded by private medical companies are exempt. So not everybody has to include women. That's one of the first problems. The other problem is when women are included in these studies, how they react to treatments, for example, is not always analyzed. So they might be a part of the study, but how they are reacting to the treatment isn't broken down and looked at as far as what are the outcomes, right? So it's no surprise that women are 75% more likely to have adverse drug reactions than men.
Wow. Say that again. 75. Say that again.
Yeah, exactly. 75% more likely to have an adverse drug reaction than men. So I could tell a personal story here really quickly. You know, I used to have really terrible insomnia. I was taking Ambien. I went to my doctor and he's like, well, we have to lower your dosage because apparently women all over the country were getting into car accidents in the morning because the medication was staying in their system longer than men. And the other question my doctor asked me was, are you getting up in the middle of the night and cooking dinner? And I was like, no. So I didn't have this reaction, but it was something that women were, and they didn't recognize this until they actually were giving them the drug. And this is a quick Google search, and you can find a lot more information on this Ambien example. But it's just one example, right? And, you know, so it's a huge problem. So 75% more likely to have an adverse drug reaction than men.
I want to go back to the very first point you made because I want to highlight it a little bit. How we manifest disease due to our gender, due to our chromosomes, the XX chromosome, the XY chromosome is different. Will you go back and just clarify that a little bit? I didn't want to miss that. I think I had no idea.
So yeah, the way we manifest symptoms is different. And we also see this in cardiovascular disease, right? And this is why so many women aren't being treated and trusted also to understand, or not necessarily understand, but when they present to their doctors are looking at diagnosing them based on the same standard as men and how men present with cardiovascular disease, and it's not the same. And that's why they're writing them off as you have the flu or you're just stressed. And then they go and within X amount of time, they actually have a heart attack. And this is why, you know, cardiovascular disease really provides us with a great example. And it's a devastating example because we know women are dying of cardiovascular disease and heart disease. And really you can link it to this. They're not being diagnosed, they're not being treated, they're not being trusted. All of these problems that we're talking about really provides a sad example of what we're seeing in gender bias.
Wow.
Does that help?
No, it totally helps. I just wanted to highlight that a little bit. As you were talking about it, I was making some notes. I was like, wait a minute, I have never heard this. And it's just fascinating. Yeah, my goodness.
When you think of heart disease, right? When you think of a heart attack, we envision a man. Like if you close your eyes and say the words heart attack, you envision a man maybe possibly holding his left arm, right? But that's not how women present with heart attacks or heart disease. So the fact that this is the vision we have in our heads, and this is also how doctors are treating women, not based on the standard of care that should be based on women, they're basing it on men. And that's the problem. That's part of the problem. So yeah, thank you for these follow-up questions. And just to piggyback, before I start talking about the trust gap, this is why it's really important to ask your doctor if your medication has been studied on women and ask how side effects may differ. Has this been tested on a woman? And or am I going to have different side effects because I'm a woman and not a man? Also, if you're, going for medical testing, how accurate is it for women? These questions matter because even if they can't answer you, it's really putting it back on the medical community to start getting these answers for us, right? And so we just talked about the knowledge gap, and next I want to talk about the trust gap. So Dusenberry breaks this down into these are the two primary problems. And the trust gap is simply that we don't believe women. This goes back to the brief history lesson rather that I just provided. And it has been really difficult to break the idea of, quote unquote, it's all in their heads and the stereotype that goes with that. We are not trusted to know our own bodies or what we're experiencing medically. And as I've already mentioned, I'm not sure I gave this exact statistic, but women are twice as likely to have a diagnosis of depression or anxiety as men. Again, you can use heart disease as the go-to example because they present with heart problems or cardiovascular problems, but they're diagnosed with anxiety or stress. And how many of us, let's just talk about the general population, have heard, oh, it's stress, it's anxiety, or we've been made to feel like we're making it up, or what we're experiencing is normal. And we really see this with women with blood disorders, right? Let's use the example of heavy periods. Well, did your mother have a heavy period? Well, there you go. That's, but we consistently feel dismissed, unheard, ignored. We're not trusted. So the result is, you've already mentioned in a way, the result is that we as women are less likely to advocate for ourselves because we're fearful of being seen as a complainer or a worrier or even hysterical. In all the research that I've done, I've still read so many examples today of doctors still referring to and calling women to their faces hysterical. So we know that the trust gap and the knowledge gap are mutually reinforcing, which should be of really great concern to our society, our medical establishments, and our doctors.
I want to bring up something. You're probably going to kill me. We did not talk about this, but I wanted to bring up something that's very common in our community, in the chronic disease community. Mothers, caretakers, consistently looked at as persistent worriers, the panic, the adamant nature that something is wrong with their child. Is there something different in that? Is it a little bit different when you're talking about a mother, when you're talking about a caretaker?
Do you mean in the context of when they take their children to the doctor and they're acting worried about their child versus they're worried about themselves?
And being taken seriously. Yeah, and being taken seriously.
That's a really great question, Amy. And I have to be honest, they haven't done enough research. No, they haven't done enough research on anything I'm talking about today. But that would be really interesting to look at. I would guess, this is not an educated, I don't have any research to base this off of, but I would guess that advocating for your child is more accepted by society and a doctor than advocating for yourself, right? I think that would be, and we could ask so many women who live with bleeding disorders this exact question. It would be really interesting.
I was about to say,
yeah, I mean, they would have the answers for us. They do. They advocate for their children, and do they feel a difference between when they're advocating for their child and they're advocating for themselves? So many of them have been in that situation. It would be an interesting discussion to have for sure.
Absolutely. I bet we get a lot of feedback about that one. So women, if you have a story, please, I'll give you some information. You can email us or something and tell us our story, or tell us your story. Yeah, that'd be great.
That'd be
great. So getting into the relational nature of all of this, obviously this is ingrained in our culture as much as we're bummed about it. But do you believe personally that there is a certain way that we as women have to communicate with our doctors in order to be heard?
Yes. So we see the use, and I'm going to use an example. We see the use of storytelling, right, in advocacy when we're talking to our elected officials about healthcare and insurance coverage, especially in the bleeding disorders community because of the high cost of the treatment. So what I look at is the importance of using storytelling during our doctor's appointments. So we know that self-advocacy and better communication skills are necessary for patients to engage their doctors, that patients who communicate in an active way are more likely to receive more information and generally have more positive interactions with their providers. So there are specific tools you can use to create your story, which will lead to better outcomes. And this is what I really dive into in the training. Through interactive sessions and role playing and scenarios, we practice those skills to becoming more empowered patients. So yes, there are ways.
That's great. That's really great. There's such a human element to this. I think we've been talking about the bias in clinical trials and, how the data is approached and affected and all those things. But how we relate in particular to that authoritative figure, the doctor, the physician, the nurse, someone who supposedly, quote unquote, knows more than we do. It's so intimidating. But I would say, like, what is their role in this? What is happening with the physician community in terms of gender bias, and how can we as patients help facilitate that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I don't want to speak to things that I don't have expertise in, but I will say, and with confidence, that not enough is happening in the doctors' communities. And This needs to start in medical school and be a part of doctors' continuing education throughout, and really looking at their unconscious bias. It's not like our doctors mean this. It's not like they're going in and understanding that, oh, I'm being biased today, right? It's unconscious, or so it's unconscious what they're doing. It's not like they mean to do this. But we need more education. We have, and again, this has to start in medical school, even giving them and making them read Maya Dusenberry's books. I feel like this book should be required reading for all medical students and doctors. And again, this is just such an important question. And as you mentioned, to answer the latter part of your question, in our society, we see doctors as authoritative figures, right? Mm-hmm. This makes it difficult to question a diagnosis or a treatment, and it makes it challenging to advocate for ourselves unless we start to shift our mindset. And this is a process. But something that I stress throughout the training is that we have to make a shift towards seeing our doctors as partners in our care, right? Mm-hmm. Looking at an appointment or a relationship with a doctor, considering the fact that they actually need us. We are the experts on our own bodies. We know when something is wrong, and really just putting it out there and reminding them of that. They can't do their jobs without us. And when we start to think about it in this way, we hopefully will start to see a shift in how we respond to our doctors during our appointments, giving us our power back. And if your doctor isn't receptive, and if your doctor isn't respectful, well, then maybe it's time to move on. And I know that that's not always easy either, but really just taking our power back and really looking, and I'll repeat this again, but looking at our doctors as partners in our care.
Man, I love that. I love that very level-headedness view of that, is that they do not come into that physician room being like, I'm going to be gender biased today. It's unconscious. Right? Yeah. And to arm ourselves as women with better questions. I mean, just to think about, to reiterate what you said, to ask your doctor about medication, like, has this been treated on women, and what were the symptoms that were, were different between men and women? It's just fantastic. It's not, it doesn't feel like we're going on a rampage, which I think that sometimes we are labeled as doing. And I just,
exactly.
That's just fantastic. And to, remind ourselves that our doctors are partners in our care. I can speak to my mom. My mom has dealt with doctors for the last 20 years. And I mean, like, in and out of relationships with physicians. And the second that she, was lucky enough to be connected with a physician that started a relationship with her, not like a 15 minutes, here's what I think I'm going to prescribe you for the year going ahead. But the second that she had a relationship with this physician, it really truly partners in her care. And I mean, she listens to my mother. I mean, she listens to the very human aspects of my mother. And I just think it's very rare. And I look at my mother's journey and how different this phase of her life feels because of the relational aspect of this physician.
Right. Yeah, it changes everything.
Yeah.
And us too, looking at them as a partner and not the authoritative figure, that also is such a key piece. Yeah.
And I think we can facilitate that as women. I mean, again, you might get into a room with your doctor where you're like, this is not going anywhere, but to facilitate that, I don't, I go into the doctor and I'm kind of like, whatever, and I'm out of there in 15 minutes. But to go in there with that mindset, I just think this is fantastic.
Right.
I'm so happy you're on the podcast, Christie.
I'm happy to be here. And I just can't. I mean, I I read this book just over a year ago, Amy, and it has really, I saw a need and an opportunity, and now I'm here with you. So yeah, it's exciting.
Great.
And such important information that we, I just can't thank you all again for having me on today.
So, I'm sure our listeners right now are saying, preach. I'm sure they have felt this in their own physician rooms and their hematology appointments. Why is bringing awareness to this particular issue so important for our bleeding disorder community? I'm sure we're all like, duh, of course it is. But with your specific knowledge of this community, your time spent within it, why is this important?
We know that women in the bleeding disorders community are dismissed, right? We know this.
Mm-hmm.
We've all heard too many horror stories from women who have gone through years of misdiagnosis or have been told they are, quote unquote, just a carrier. They're not believed. They're not trusted to know their own bodies. They're not even trusted to know more than of course they're not trusted to know more than their doctors, but we see this specifically when women present at the emergency room or the emergency department, and the doctors in the emergency room and department don't believe that they even have a bleeding disorder. And then when the women try to advocate for themselves when they're tried, the doctors attempt to give them incorrect medications, we know and hear all of these examples all the time, too often. And I am sure that so many women to this right now are listening to this right now. They're shaking their heads in agreement. As you said, we've heard it all. This is so relevant to this community. But what we also know is that women in the bleeding disorders community are fierce. I personally have learned so much from them, right? Yeah. I mean, they are fierce women, not to be messed with. And they have inspired me to be a better professional and a person. And I honestly when I write something, I'm like, could women in the bleeding disorder benefit from this? In the bleeding disorders community benefit from this? Because if they can, then I think anybody can. And that's such a compliment to the just amazing advocates we have in the community. And the training and the information I discussed today really gives them even more ammo. It helps them to become even stronger advocates for themselves. And it also validates what they've experienced throughout their lives. I know that people look at my lineup of workshops, and I think the history one is probably the one that people are like, oh, I don't need that. I really encourage people to think twice about that, because I think what the history module and presentation that I give does is it validates the experiences we've lived. It shows us that we're not crazy, that this is actually thousands of years of history that we're dealing with. And, really showing us that, we do have work to do, but there's a reason that it's there. And I just, again, want to highlight because the powerful series that you're doing, your other podcast series on empowering women, because there are just so many great examples of the fierce warrior women that I'm talking about and how they're overcoming barriers, these barriers that we're describing.
What a great compliment to that podcast series. If you haven't checked it out, the Empowering Women podcast series is a 3-part series. It's hosted by one of our most beloved Believe contributors, Heather Robb. It's wonderful, and we've had such positive feedback from it. So if you haven't checked that out, as you're listening today and you get kind of emotional with what Christie said, like I did just now, that would be a good way to follow up, is to listen to that series. It's great. So you ladies.
It is really great. I started listening to it a couple of days ago, and I actually happened to see it on Facebook, and I was like, oh, what's this? Like, this complements exactly everything that I'm going to be saying. So I listened, and really, really powerful stories, and stories that we know are going to lead to incredible change. I really, truly believe that. So yeah, again, listen to that other series as well.
Love it. So this stuff is so good. It's so fascinating. It's so important. Tell me a little bit, kind of as we close down here, what went into creating this curriculum as you've built these series of trainings? It's not just one training, it's a series of trainings. Kind of what went into this in the last couple of years that you've built this?
Honestly, this question makes me smile. A lot went into creating this. It's been a journey. As you can imagine, from sifting through the history to creating interactive workshops to actually address the problem of bias during our medical appointments, it took a lot of research and planning. I started by understanding the problem, researching possible solutions, and also asking myself questions such as, how can we overcome these barriers as patients? And how do I create a resource that will provide the knowledge and skills to better navigate our medical journeys? Based on my findings, I developed workshops. There are 5 of them to address the disparities. Each workshop can be offered as a standalone session, but I do recommend the entire series because that way you get the history and then, the how to talk to your doctor, the storytelling, and I go into, actually, I can summarize the skills that you walk away with if you do the entire series is, 1, you will understand gender bias, how gender bias leaves women sick and misdiagnosed. You will understand how to identify key ways to prepare for your doctor's appointments, and these are evidence-based, recommended by doctors. You will be able to practice using your voice and story as an advocacy tool for better care. You'll be able to demonstrate the importance of seeing your doctor as a partner in your care, which we just discussed. And then you'll be able to apply these skills in an interactive and supportive setting. So really, Amy, you've experienced my training. You will not sit and be bored. It's the core of my, right? I make you get involved. It's fun, it's interactive, and especially with such a heavy topic, I really make sure that we're practicing the skills that you need and you're leaving and walking away, not just with information, but skills to put these things to use once you're at your doctor's appointment. And if you don't mind, I actually have to give a special shout out to a special person. I had in the spring semester, I had a master's of public health practicum student working with me. Her name is Christie VanHorne, and I honestly could not have done this without her. Her help was invaluable. So I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Kristen and thank her for all of her help and hard work on this curriculum.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, she was incredible. So
I know we are laser focused on the bleeding disorder community, in particular on this podcast, but I do feel like this information is, obviously built for all of us as women. And so who is your target audience really for these trainings? Just in, helping some of our listeners, some of our chapter leaders that maybe, obviously for the bleeding disorder community, but maybe some other communities that they are involved with. Who is your target audience?
My target audience is really the general public, women in particular. I would love the chance to work with, women of color and also the LGBT community. I think, anyone can benefit from this training. Women are obviously my target audience, also youth. And I'll mention in a minute, I've gotten some really great feedback that has really provided, overwhelmingly, the participants felt that they wish they had this at a younger age. They wish they had the information and the skills at a younger age, right? So I think we all feel that way. Oh, if I knew how to do this, and this is something that I've always practiced throughout my medical journey, so to speak, then, maybe I wouldn't have X, Y, and Z problem at this point in my life. So I think that that's definitely, younger people would be a great audience as well. And there are 2 of the sessions that can be offered as quote unquote, how to talk to your doctor that are applicable for any audience. So they can be tweaked a little bit and could be appropriate for anyone, even men. And I don't mean to say men can use these skills too. So
I think so. I think so. And to have them be more aware, absolutely. No, I think this is universal. Tell us some more about the feedback that you've heard when you've presented this. I know you've presented this several times, but give us some nuggets about what people have said.
So it's been really overwhelmingly positive. I had one woman say that because of the training, she's actually going to speak to her doctor about an issue she had been experiencing for 5 years, but didn't know how to approach the topic. As I mentioned just now, everyone wishes they had it at a younger age. And I had one woman who I know personally is a really strong self-advocate, but, and I quote, she said, I was thoroughly engrossed in Christie's workshop on this topic. I came away with a host of new tools for self-advocacy going forward. And my favorite quote, and this one actually makes me a little teary-eyed, but the workshop was nothing short of incredible. It was empowering to learn how to be your own best advocate in a medical setting and validating to hear that many people share similar challenges navigating the healthcare system. This workshop is a crucial tool for women, people of color, LGBT folks, and anyone who has ever felt ignored or marginalized by our healthcare system. And so, and the feedback, Amy, I have to say, first and foremost, validates my reason for doing this. I know this is necessary. I know we all need this. We need to feel empowered. We need the tools to question our doctors. We need the tools to tell our doctors what's going on with us. Where else do we learn these things? I get excited and emotional when I read these things.
I think that's a wonderful point that we haven't even touched on here as we're wrapping up. It can feel so isolating to have these issues, and you really do feel like you're the only one. And to realize that this is a cultural, systematic way of how we approach healthcare, how we relate in healthcare, that might take the pressure off of ourselves a little bit, and just taking the pressure off of you're crazy, you're insane, no one's listening to you, to just realize that, this is, one step forward a little bit as we learn to relate with ourselves better, and just to see ourselves as women as part of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, there are just so many little key activities that I do throughout the training that, help women to feel validated in their experiences, because let's be honest, I don't think there is a woman that has not experienced some of this somewhere in their life. It's just, and that in and of itself is such a huge societal problem, right?
Yeah.
There is not one woman that you could talk to that would say, oh no, I've never felt dismissed by a doctor, or I haven't felt trusted to know what's wrong with me. And then you put a chronic disease on top of that and forget about it. I mean, the experiences that so many women, have are just heartbreaking. And what I really try to do, along with all the other skills, is create an environment where there's this sense of safety to share, and creating that environment where there is also that validation.
Friend, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. My goodness. Let's reiterate how our listeners can connect with you if they have questions or if they would like to book a training with you. How do we go about that?
Yeah, again, I would really love to hear from you. My website, again, is CVH Consulting, LLC.com. And as I mentioned, there's a contact button up in the right corner, so that'll take you to my email. My email is Christie, so CHRISTIE at CVHconsultingllc.com. And then, of course, again, social media. So Instagram and Twitter, just at CVH Consulting. And same on Facebook. And then, LinkedIn too. I'd love to hear from people on LinkedIn. And it's my name, Christie VanHorne. So please connect. I would love to answer any additional questions you have, or, continue this discussion. That would be another really great, as Amy mentioned, we've talked about a couple of things we'd love to hear back from the community about during this podcast as well, because your voices matter.
Absolutely. This has been a joy, and I can't stress how important the information is. So I just appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy.
Hey everybody, just a reminder that we would love to hear your stories of gender bias. What was it like in that doctor's office? What was it like as you overcame your fear? What was it like as you advocated for yourself? Email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. And if you'd like to have Christie host a training at your upcoming event, you can find her on her website, cvhconsultingllc.com. She's also all over social media, so you can find her at Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we would love to continue this conversation. That is all for episode 28 of the Ask the Expert podcast series. We'll be back next month with another expert interview.
Have you checked out Living with Hemophilia yet? If you have, kudos to you. Not only are you eager to join the exciting community of discourse and helpful information, you're also a keen listener and patron of the arts. But if you haven't taken a swim through livingwithhemophilia.com, take a moment to pull it up on the ol' internet. I think you'll love it. Helpful content, relevant updates, and, most of all, a bunch of people going through the same things you are. It's a growing part of the online Living with Hemophilia community, brought together by the good people at Bayer. Also, put it on your Facebook to-do list. Hit the like button on the Living with Hemophilia Facebook page. It's a good alternative to looking at the slideshow of your neighbor's recent foot surgery. I mean, unless you're into that sort of thing. Living with Hemophilia from Bayer. Check it out.
Bloodstreammedia.com is your one-stop shop for all of Bloodstream Media's podcasts for the bleeding disorder community.
Once on bloodstreammedia.com, don't forget to follow the links to subscribe to the Bloodstream podcast, Ask the Expert podcast, the Powering Through podcast, and the Bloodline podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Have an idea for a future episode of Ask the Expert? Have a question that you would like to hear an expert answer?
Email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You'll also find Bloodstream Media on facebook.com/bloodstreammedia and on Twitter at bloodstreaminfo.
This episode of Ask the Expert was written by Amy Board.
Produced by Patrick James Lynch.
Rob Bradford.
Joshua Sterling Bragg.
Avra Friedman.
And Colby Crow. Artwork by Katie Wright Mead.
And Ryan Geelan.
And the Ask the Expert podcast is edited by Allison Stoney.
I'm your host, Amy Board, and until next time, embrace that mystery and fear of life. You are not alone.